remember a segment we did, this was during the middle of the last college football season, answering an Emmanuel Acho video, wondering why is there an SEC bias in college football, and it made no sense to him, and he showed all these reasons, this and that. Mm-hmm. And all that it came down to is look at the number of players in the SEC drafted over the last 10 years into the NFL compared to everybody else. If you think that there is a bias towards the SEC, that it's the best league in college football, well, the reason is because it is. There's more talent in the SEC.
No doubt about it.
League, and that's by far. Connor O'Gara points this out during the NFL draft. 8 consecutive NFL drafts, 50 selections from the SEC or more, and not a single other conference has hit 50 during that stretch. So, Connor, I mean, it all makes sense, right? We can answer Emmanuel Acho and say, dude, look at the draft. Look at what just happened. It's just, this is something you get used to now.
I love the way that you pronounce his last name, Acho. Like, it's like a sneeze. I think he goes with more of like an emphasis on the first syllable, like an Acho. Not so much like, maybe that's more of a sneeze, actually, now that I say it out loud. But look, if that's still a take, I mean, what are we doing here? That's just like the laziest narrative I've ever heard. As it relates to the NFL draft, it's undeniable. If NFL front offices are continuing to say that year after year, which they are, if we're seeing this play out at the recruiting level, we're seeing it play out in the college football playoff. The SEC is 12-3 in games in the college football playoff that aren't against one another. These numbers just continue to add up year after year after year. It's 3 straight years in which an SEC team won the national championship, 4 of the last 5. Like, I don't know. Like, we can go on and on. If Emmanuel, as you would pronounce, Acho, continues to hold on to these narratives, he's going to have to get really creative. I'm actually kind of looking forward to seeing the way that he's going to be able to spin this stuff.
Well, you can't spin it any more than just pointing at the draft numbers. Is there another draftee that has more pressure than Treylon Burks because of who it is that he's replacing, essentially? I mean, it was like a one-for-one trade, A.J. Brown to move up and select Treylon Burks. And I think Treylon's going to be a very, very good NFL wide receiver, if not great. But, to start your rookie season essentially looked at as just a replacement for A.J. Brown, like, that's tough.
I actually kind of hated that. And I'm glad that he went in the first round. The fact that there were 5 receivers who came off the board ahead of him still has me scratching my head. But I was a little bit uneasy about the point that you just brought up. This is the guy who was being compared to DK Metcalf going into the combine, was considered a disappointment because he didn't have the same measurables as DK Metcalf. And now, oh, by the way, even though you were the 6th receiver off the board, you're expected to be like A.J. Brown. Meanwhile, there's a guy like Chris Olave who goes to a situation in New Orleans where he's going to get to play with Mike Thomas. He's going to have one of the top targets in the NFL to be able to kind of play off of. And Treylon Burks is going to a situation where I don't know how long Ryan Tannehill is going to be there. It looks like he's going to be there for one more year, and then his contract's going to be up. They're going to go in a different direction. But, man, that's a situation with Malik Willis kind of taking that spot potentially. But that's a situation where, man, like, they're going to have a lot of pressure on him. I was just in Nashville. They've got A.J. Brown stuff all over the place there. He was one of the faces of that franchise. And to now go into this spot where you're going to be expected to kind of be that guy. And we've seen rookie receivers have a lot of success in recent memory in the NFL, Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, and now it's going to be like, hey, you're going to be considered, a guy who should live up to that, despite the fact that there were a bunch of NFL front offices who said that they like that other receivers better for some reason.
Mm-hmm. And Connor, we talked about the fact that the SEC now for the 8 straight years had 50-plus draft picks in the NFL draft, and not another conference has even come really all that close to doing it one time. How long do you think that streak continues? I mean, is another conference getting close, gaining any ground? I mean, Michigan had a lot of players taken this year. Obviously a lot of guys out of Ohio State. Is the Big Ten catching ground on them, or is this going to be a statistic that in 10 years we're talking about it's now 18-plus years and nobody else is close?
Nobody's going to come close. It's just not going to happen. I mean, with expansion coming too, with Texas and Oklahoma coming to the conference, I realize you can't rely on Texas to have a single draft pick, but you can rely on Montana State to have multiple draft picks. I realize that's tough, but at the same time, I would tend to think that Oklahoma at least will pull its weight. And Texas will have more NFL draft talent when the likes of Bijan Robinson and Quinn Ewers are able to be draft eligible and whatnot. And I think, though, it's a perfectly fair point to bring up. Like, what can actually bring this streak to an end? Because this was a year in which Nick Saban only had 7 players in the NFL draft. I say only because he's usually having more. You know, like having double-digit guys out of Alabama is a pretty common thing. And everybody has said, well, what happens if you take Alabama away? It's like, all right, well, you know, Georgia and LSU, they're still going to be able to have a ton of talent. I mean, LSU had 10 players taken in this draft, and they were a 6-win team. I mean, this isn't necessarily going to be anything that changes overnight, and the Big Ten is probably the only other conference that can get somewhat close, but that hasn't happened yet, and I don't expect that to all of a sudden change when these coaches have been locked in. I mean, the Big Ten has not had coaching turnover. I don't expect that all of a sudden to just turn around.
Mm-hmm. And you bring up Texas, the fact that, and it's been a lot of jokes today and yesterday, and you know, Saturday after the draft was, you know, wrapped up of schools that had more draft picks than Texas. Pretty much any school that had a guy drafted had more than Texas because they did have 0. One thing that hasn't been criticized enough, because I think most people are wrapped up and love to laugh at Texas. What about the state of Florida itself? I mean, we're talking about Florida State with 1 draft pick, the University of Florida with 3, Central Florida had 1, South Florida 0, Miami 0, FAU 0, FIU 0. The University of Georgia alone had more first-round picks than the entire state of Florida had draft picks from 1 to 7. How come nobody's criticizing what's going on in the Sunshine State right now?
Texas is an easier punching bag, that's why. But you're right. You're 100% right. In this year of football in the state of Florida, and as somebody who lives here and who kind of understands the dynamics and the way that these fan bases operate, unprecedented how bad it was. I mean, think about the coaches that were on the way out with Dan Mullen, with Manny Diaz, who, in my opinion, was wrongfully fired, but I get why they made the move to go to Mario Cristobal. And then at Florida State, which has just been in a total dumpster fire since Jimbo Fisher left. This is a situation in which you kind of look at the landscape and you'd say, well, how can Texas be like that? How could all these programs in the state of Florida be like that? It's because we are spending more and more on recruiting, and the sport has never been more national with the way that it's recruited. That's the biggest piece of this entire thing. Mm-hmm. If recruiting is getting more national, that means more schools are able to go into the state of Florida, more schools are able to be able to pluck that talent. There's no longer a school that can say, oh, yeah, we're gonna just make a line across I-4 the way that Miami used to do when they were truly the U back in the day. There's no way that you can be able to carve off that kind of territory and say, we're not letting any kids leave the bottom half of this state. And that's why I think we're seeing some of these numbers. Historically bad they were this past year. I expect that'll change, but at the same time, this is the new floor, and it might be the new reality for some of these programs in the Sunshine State.
I want to ask about this situation with maybe he's going to be former Pitt wide receiver who says he's going into the transfer portal. Jordan Addison, one of the best players in the country, returning. I don't know if he's in the portal now or not, but I'm reading over the weekend. Maybe he's going in, maybe he's not. But there's the thought that there might be some tampering happening because he's got his sights set on Southern Cal and Lincoln Riley. What's going on with this situation? Because even Paul Feinbaum's come out and said, yes, there's probably tampering, but nobody cares about it. What's happening here?
There's no way there's not tampering. There's no possible way in which there wasn't tampering. The NCAA has a tampering rule, but it is absolutely pointless if it's not being enforced. Even in the most blatant case like this one, in which we're seeing reports come out about USC's potential compensation package, what that would look like for Jordan Addison, who returns as the Blitnikoff winner, and what that would be in comparison to somebody like Kenny Pickett, who was just drafted in the first round. I mean, it's insane to think about that. And some people are looking at this saying, well, we need to cap NIL. If tampering is actually enforced, and that might be a utopic thing, but if it's actually enforced in a couple of these blatant examples, then there can actually be change. And I go back to the thing with faking injuries. NCAA has a rule in place for faking injuries, but they've essentially said, you know what, we can't do anything. We're going to leave it up to these coaches and these programs to kind of police themselves. They're not. Okay, they're just not. I don't care if Pat Narduzzi walks on the Lincoln Riley's doorstep in his $12,000 square foot home and says, hey, you blatantly tampered and I'm not leaving here until you admit that and I get it on record. If the NCAA doesn't do a thing about it, it's not going to do anything. And this sport isn't going to change, and that dynamic is still going to be there. It's a unique situation that has a lot of short and long-term impacts, but it is a wild thing to process, and this is kind of the hole that the NCAA has opened up if they're not going to investigate any sort of tampering with a case like this.
Mm. And you bring up, talk about tampering and the NCAA and everything that seems to be wrong with college athletics right now. Do you think if the NCAA were to crack down on tampering, that it would almost take care of everything else, almost start a domino effect of, well, we wouldn't be seeing all these problems with NIL, with the transfer portal may slow down and get to somewhat of a more normal going forward type of rate, that if they would just do this one thing, 99% of their other problems would fade away?
No, I don't think it would. Tampering, it's always going to exist. It's always going to exist. It didn't just exist with the start of NIL. Like I pointed this example out yesterday that Lars Anderson had this book about Dabo Swinney. Like, once upon a time, C.J. Spiller is a freshman at Clemson, and he's walking around Florida's campus being pitched by Tim Tebow. You know, like, tampering has been happening for a long time. It's just now being associated with money, and it's now out in the open with some of these NIL deals, so we have a different sort of lens that we're looking through. But at the same time, yes, if you can actually have the NCAA come out and say, look, we're able to investigate Scott Frost for having a special teams coordinator who was too involved in the program, and we're able to dig into a case like that, but we're not able to dig into a case like this where the best receiver in college football was clearly tampered with by a program making a potential 8-figure offer. If you're not willing to make that rule, then just abolish the rule and accept that this is the new reality. But in my opinion, if you make a statement like this, it would have some sort of an impact, but tampering is still going to exist in some capacity.
Sounds like the lights are on and nobody's home, but that's how we felt about the NCAA for a long, long time now.
Our partners at BetOnline continue to be the #1 source for all your betting needs and sports info. Find all the latest sports developments, including updated odds on the NBA playoffs, fights, and even next season's futures. And don't forget that the MLB is back as well. Who are you picking to win the World Series? BetOnline is your continued source for all your sports wagering needs, including live betting and your favorite Vegas casino and poker games. It's super easy to get started, so head to the website today or use your mobile device to join and use our promo code BELIEVE, that's BLEAV, to receive your 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. Bet online, where the game starts.